Everybody, welcome to our third webinar of the series where we talk about how to basically build a show file specifically for theater. In this video, we're going to talk about a couple of functions that deal with playback. So we're going to go into further detail on things like marking. We're going to talk about some timing functions, wait and follow. We're going to talk about fade and delay. We're going to talk about how to utilize multiple cue lists, and hopefully if there's time, we're going to get into a little bit of plotting and pixel mapping. So I'm Noah. Most of y'all that have kind of watched the webinars before have probably seen me or Megan. We also have our good friend Matt Guminski, who's a fabulous designer and programmer and hogspert, essentially. Anything you guys want to say before we kind of get started on the topics?
I'm okay. We can jump in.
Let's go. Let's do this.
Let's do it.
Do it.
So the first thing that we were going to kind of talk about today is marking on hog and how it is beneficial. So basically marking is just our word for move in black. So it basically presets functions on a moving light to be in the position if the light is basically off or at zero. So we actually have marking disabled by default, and you would have to go back and enable it on a per cue basis. But there is a way that you can do it in your cue list. Everything automatically marks. So let's just start together a little cue list here. So here we are, our solo washes. I'm just going to record that as a cue. Put that onto master 9. And the next cue, I'm going to tell them to go to 0. Record that onto master 9. And then we'll tell them to go to full. And we'll pick a color and pick a position. I don't think I had any crazy positions from the last episode. And we'll use that one. And we'll record that onto a third cue. So under sort of normal circumstances, if we were to play this cue, your lights will come up, your lights will go out, and as you crossfade into the third cue, you're going to see your lights coming up from white, and they're going to see that crossfade of a position. So in the rock and roll world or kind of live event world, sometimes that's the effect that you want. Generally in the theater world, you don't really want to see those kind of crossfade transitions. You just want to see your lights show up. So that's where you would want to put a mark, which there's a column for it here in the cue list window. So you just want to put a mark. And I'll say fade. We'll talk about what the fade time does on mark here in a second. But let's release this cue list and play it over again. So here we are once again in Q1. Q2, our lights are black, and Q3, oop, I didn't get enough time.
Just wait for it to turn orange.
I know, I should wait. So here we are. If you actually look in the crossfade function there of the mark column, it'll go a solid orange. That tells you that the mark is complete. And if you press play, our lights just simply appear on stage. There is no crossfade. Basically everything except for intensity was already going to the next cue. So one thing that I get questions about a lot is the fade function. So what does that mean? So it basically means that the lights are going to very slowly crossfade into their destination. The reason why we do it that way is that, especially in theater, you might have like a bit of silence, or you might not have any background noise to sort of muffle an intelligent light's motors. So as you don't want to hear the motor go across the stage, you don't want to hear the gobo wheel spin, the color wheel flags going in and out. So that's why we always assume to have a fade, so that it slowly crossfades in. That can kind of get you in trouble, like it just did when I was talking about it a few moments ago, where you can kind of catch yourself mid crossfade. So if you want, you can actually go in and set a time of, say, 0 seconds in the mark column, and then now the fixtures will, as soon as they are black, just jump immediately to where they need to go. So we'll go ahead and skip to the next cue.
Funny story about that. I was doing a show with scrollers, and I just set the default to 0 because that's just what I do. And the scrollers definitely preset in a
Very
0
loud.
from one end of the scroll to the next. And I think I gave actors a heart attack, which was pretty funny. When you have 65 scrollers presetting.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, you
that's
don't
just a
want to do
little
that.
loud.
Just a tad bit.
You can set your default mark time in your queue list options. So that's something that if if 2 seconds is too long or too short, or you just want to go straight to zero, you can do that. So with this example of mark of 2 seconds, I press play. Now keep in mind that they will not start marking until they actually hit zero. And then as soon as that queue is complete, they've already sort of jumped in. Thankfully, we're in a visualizer, so we can't hear our fixtures. So yeah, marking is good for a couple of things. It doesn't have to be used for queue lists. I'll use marking a lot of times whenever I have like a queue stack where I need my fixtures to start at a specific position and then do the fan out or whatever that I need them to do. So I'll sort of mark them in the first queue. The first queue is a zero queue essentially. Once that mark is complete, then I'm kind of like preparing that function to fire. I press play again, and then it shoots across the stage. I'll probably make a quick example of that. Let's do one. So like sometimes I'll just shoot this up here. So I'm gonna shoot them straight up in the air. I'm gonna record that to a queue list as zero. And then in my next queue, I want them to come down and at full. Record that at the queue. So pretty simple. The first queue, I'll give it a mark time of zero. And let's take a look at it. So we'll press play on the first queue. Can't see anything. And then I'll actually give this a longer fade time, which we'll talk about in a second. Now if I press play, my lights are preset from that position and they crossfade down. And in reality, I probably would have had like a different color or maybe a different gobo or something like that. But that's just the concept of marking, right? It moves your lights in black. Anything you guys want to add on to marking?
Just make sure that your lights are actually out in the queue before that you want to mark, and the mark applies to where the movement is that you want to happen. So you apply the mark where you want the movement to happen, where the new position or new color or new beam actually is, and then your lights have to be out in the queue before it for the fixtures to actually for the mark to actually take.
And to add on to that, Maegan, if you're using intensity red, green, blue instead of cyan, magenta, yellow, the mark will not work because it's seeing an intensity. So yeah, just be aware of that, guys.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I mean, those are really the main gotchas, is the light is not out in the queue before, or the mark is not set correctly on the right queue, or as Matt said, you're using I red, I green, I blue. But if you've been listening to the previous webinars, you were probably either converted over to HuStat or to CMY.
I'm just saying, we're just bringing it full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, no, just kidding. We'll talk about that. So cool. That's kind of my comments for marking. Next thing we're going to talk about is just some further timing functions.
Yeah. So let's talk about those fade times, delay times, and those paths now, which we know are very important literally in any show, actually, not even just theater, just like how you're going to apply your fade times and your delay times and your wait time and your paths and all that good stuff. So your fade time is going to be like how you get from Q1 to Q2. And I'm just going to do an overview, and then Noah's going to take it from here with like examples and stuff. So your fade time is going to be how you get from Q1 to Q2. So like how long it's going to take. Your delay time is how long after you press go does the queue actually wait before you execute. And then your wait time is going to be how long does the queue wait until it automatically goes. So that's going to be like follow or hang on other consoles. So like if you want to make a follow queue, that's whenever you start with your wait times. And then your path is how we actually execute that crossfade. And now I'm going to hand it over to Noah to show more examples since we had a little bit of an overview.
Yeah, so I'm just going to throw something together here. Make just a couple of really simple cyc queues. big orange. So yeah, so go ahead and maximize this. So the fade time, like Megan said, that's the time that it takes you to get from A to B. So if I were to press play, the fade time is 2 seconds on all of these cues. That's the default. You can change that in your preferences. So it's crossfading the hue and the saturation values on these fixtures over 2 seconds. So if I were to extend that, so if I were to say 10 seconds, here we are in Q2, we press play, it's going to take 10 seconds to get from A to B, essentially. And you can see that crossfade in the weight column. It'll tell you that as a percentage. So that one's pretty easy. It's the A to B time. You can also change a range of values really quickly. So if I were to highlight these cells, press set and say 5, enter, now everything has a 5-second fade time, which is really handy if I forget to program in the times. So the next one is delay. So delay has a couple of different functions. You can use it in this window to essentially delay the start of the queue. So if I were to say delay 2 seconds on Q3, I'll go ahead and press on Q2. Here we are in Q2, and let it fully crossfade. I'll press play, and nothing will happen for a solid 2 seconds, and then you'll see the crossfade start. So you can use delay in this column. I generally like to program in my delays on a per cue basis, and I really prefer to do it on like a fanned basis.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that, let me go ahead and go down to my group directory. I did record a group earlier today that is the Psych fixtures going across, essentially. So the selection order basically goes from left to right, if I remember correctly. And so what you can do is you can select those fixtures. You can actually open up the queue itself. So I just double tapped queue, and you can program in the delay times that you want from this window. But I like to use the syntax where I'll say time. That would actually denote a fade time, which I'm going to come back to. A second time allows you to actually input in a delay time. And so if I were to say a range, so if I were to say 0 through 5, enter, I've actually specified a delay time across my fixture selection. I'm going to hit update and take a look at this queue. So we'll go back to Q2. And if I did this right, press play, and we should actually get a left to right 5-second delay going across our psych there.
Another fun thing you can do is actually, if you want to do a fan out from center, you can do 0 through 5 through 0, or reverse that 5 through 0 through 5. It's a lot. It's a way to get some really cool fade.
So we'll do yours 5 through 0 through 5. I'll hit update, and I will go back a cue, and then play the cue. Oops, I didn't do the group, but I did it off of the normal.
It's all good.
It looks cool.
It looks really.
It does look cool. So here, let's do this. Let me psych across. So I've selected that group. QQ. Time 5 through 0 through 5. Enter. Update, and we will go back. Now press play. There we go. So there's your inside out. So once again, your selection order is super important.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do that.
But you can through selection order and through fanning your delay times and your normal fade times, you can get some really great transitions and effects and whatnot.
So let's. I just made a change to the fade time here. This is what it would look like if it was a 0-second fade. So it's a snap, which is kind of nice because you don't see any of the values between the two cues. You just see red to that cyan color.
Yeah. I thought you were just getting all artsy fartsy there, having it go into drop into another color.
Hey,
we are in the theater.
I set the program right. I didn't say I was a good designer.
Artsy fartsy.
So yeah, so you can program in your fade and your delay times in the queue. You can also do it directly in the programmer. And this is actually the method that I prefer. I prefer to have it in the programmer and then record that into a queue or merge it into a queue versus recording it as a default time and then going back and changing it. So let's do this. Let's do the second cross group. We'll say at full, and let's do. We're gonna get some kind of interesting here. Let's do 100% saturation. And for the hue, let's do an inside out hue. So 0 through 120 through 0. That's just one of my favorites. Gonna get red on the outside, green in the middle. So that's me fanning my hue directly through what's called direct entry selection, where I hold set and I spin my encoder wheel that I want to enter in the range for. Now, if I were to look at the programmer, so I'm going to close this window and open up the programmer window, I can set discrete timing. So you can also do it on a per parameter basis. So for example, I might want to say color time 0, enter, but I can say intensity time 2, let's do 3, enter. So now actually when I record this cue, anything that fits under the color mask is going to have a fade time of 0, but a intensity time of 3. I could also once again fan that. So if I said intensity time 3, let's do time 3 through 0 through 3, enter. And I can now record that as a cue. So I'll hit record and put that onto the same master. And hopefully I did it right. Press play here. And I'll actually release that. The intensities were already at full previous cue, but now we're at 0. We'll press play. And there you go. You can make a pretty cool effect with having different fade times on your different parameters on intensity and on color. So that's the times in the queue. I believe, Megan, you talked a little bit about follow and wait times in the console, so we'll kind of demonstrate how that works.
Before we leave the fade and, well, I guess this would follow the follow cues, but that's fine. So like Noah just showed like how you can get this really cool like transition type things. Like whenever I'm doing a lot of like theater shows, if I'm looking for any type of effect that's very specific in that regards, like I always go to my fade times and my delay times first rather than messing around with the effects engine. Just because you can be very specific, especially with the timing of things like Noah just did with his delay time and his fade times. Like it getting something similar to this probably isn't that hard in the effect engine, but then once you start changing like your fade times and your delay times and you want it to be more precise, I should say, if you want precision, like really following these fan delay and these fan intensities and stuff like that, that is usually how I can get the precision I need very quickly.
No, I totally agree. Sometimes you need a very, very specific look on stage that maybe the effect engine isn't the best option for, and sometimes maybe pixel mapping might be a better option. But we'll talk about this later on in the video, but we'll talk about how to sort of make an effect out of this by turning it into a chase and then using comment macros to essentially trigger and release it. So let's talk about the different timing functions, so how you can trigger a cue. So everything in the wait column of the master window basically determines when a cue gets triggered. So you have halt, you have wait, follow, time code, manual, and clock. So halt time basically means like you got to press go on yourself, as well as manual means basically the same thing. You can manually press go. The difference kind of between them is that if you did have timecode frames in your console, so you're shooting in timecode frames to the console, if you have a cue that's listed as manual, it can't be overridden by a timecode frame. And that deals with this really cool function called learn timing, which I'll probably talk about at the end of this example. But the two that you really need to know about is going to be wait and follow. So wait is basically from the start of the previous cue, that cue will trigger, and follow is from the end of the previous cue, that cue will trigger. So if we were to put a I'm just going to get rid of all these delays just so we don't confuse anything. So I'm going to set everything to 3 seconds and give everything a 0-second delay. So if I were to go to Q3 and I say a wait time of 2, what that means is that as soon as I trigger Q2, it's going to start counting down, and after 2 seconds, Q3 is going to automatically trigger. Something to keep in mind is that everything in Q3 overrides everything in Q2 because it's the same functions, the same fixtures, same color values. So Q2 actually won't fully complete. So you'll actually get like 66% of the way in and then automatically start jumping into the next queue. So you kind of have to remember, do you want the queue to trigger from the start of the previous queue or from the end of the previous queue? So that's where the other function, which is follow, comes in. So if I were to say a follow of 3, and I trigger Q2, it's going to fully crossfade over 3 seconds and then jump right into the next queue. You can also do a follow plus time. So if I were to say follow plus 2 enter, what that means is that once Q2 is complete, it's going to wait for 2 seconds and then start the next queue. So you can do a wait plus time or a follow plus time.
I like the wait because I use the follow more than I use the wait. Just in the way I do my queue stacking for theater, but I have used the wait a few times when a director's like, oh, I'd like to see it dip into this color before we go into this, which is what you were explaining.
Yeah, and so something to keep in mind as well is that, if you have a follow on Q3 and then you change this fade time to say the, 8 seconds, your total time for this whole queue stack is now sort of increased and you've kind of pushed everything back. So if you did have this kind of like roughly synced to some music without using like time code or any of those more formal functions, you can all of a sudden have everything be sort of delayed. So that's where wait is really handy because it keeps everything a little more in line. But then again, sometimes you need it to follow right after the queue.
Yeah. I think in terms of follow, not wait, but
and that's fine. Yeah, I mean,
I just like to type it. It's two different ways to do things. So
right. Yeah, I mean, I use both.
Yeah.
I'm mainly a follow person, but the waits are better for me if I'm doing like an auto for a mark. Then I'll do a wait time instead.
Interesting. I do a follow. It just shows people do things differently, and that's the beauty of the console. You can do it a million different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then I can time out the mark correctly, and it's just like automatically, like I just wait the amount of time the mark needs. No, I do a follow. There are times that, sorry, I'm trying to think. Pre-COVID times, what did I do? It's been so long.
I would do a follow after
to plus.
Yeah. Yep.
I do the follow plus for the mark. But there are wait times that I really like to do instead of the follow, just because it's a very precise, like, I'm going to go like this long after I hit go on the previous queue. Like, it's a lot more precise for me. And I think it's more of the reason that Noah said, where if I adjust my fade time for whatever reason, my wait time might not change. Like, I might just need, like, if I'm doing a color crossfade, I might need the fixtures to just come in sooner, for example. So then or the color just needs to be longer. So if I extend that color fade time, my next queue is still coming in at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But
I agree with all those things.
Different ways to do things and get the same results.
Yeah, it just depends. Another thing that we kind of wanted to cover, and I believe we actually covered this in the first video briefly, and that is path. So path is really handy, especially for color changes and especially on like site changes and things like that. So I'm going to just put a path on everything here.
Actually, I don't know if you guys have used it before, but on fixed gobo wheels, path can be really fun to slam into different. It's actually a really cool transition. So instead of seeing like a gobo wheel like rotate, if you wanted that kind of live move, you can actually put a path on a gobo roll, and you get these really cool like bouncy effects and transitions, and it's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I do it for color wheels mainly.
Color wheels too. Yeah.
We'll do. So one of my favorites is always over. So if I press play, it'll actually kind of go past the value, which in this cue is orange, and go ahead and skip back so you can see it again. So you'll watch as we crossfade, we're actually going over orange to red and then back to orange. This can also be maybe better explained with movers. So we'll say 121 through at full. Go ahead and tilt them. So we'll do something similar where I'd put the first cue here, chord here, and the next cue will put them just straight down, the chord here. And we'll do a path of over. So this might be a little easier to see if you're not so familiar with like how color works, but we'll play the first cue. And then the second cue, we actually go past our point and then back in. So that's essentially how like an overpath works. You could also do, say, a underpath, where it actually goes the opposite direction and then goes back to where it's supposed to be. So they actually tick up and then go to their final destination. So you can kind of use paths to kind of get a unique crossfade from one cue to another. Let's do one of my favorites as well. Let's do shape, which is kind of just like a random path. So press play. You kind of see the lights just kind of shake in a weird way, and then they get to their final destination. We'll increase the fade time for like 8 seconds. And hopefully the video delay is not too bad. So that's path, and you can, just like you can program your cue times, you can go in and program in your paths on a per cue basis or a per parameter basis. So you could go in and you can say, hey, I want all of my hue and saturation values to be a shake, but then I want my intensity values to be a different path. All right, anything else you guys want to add?
No, not necessarily. Like Noah said, you can change all of these while you're also programming. So like if you know you want your specific path, like at the point of your recording your cue, you can change that in the programmer the exact same way. You just change it with your cues, where you go up at the top and you change your tab to path, and you can go and change it there. Select the cells, hit set, choose whatever you want it to be, and it'll change. You can also change the default paths in your edit fixtures, right? I'm not making that up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So inside your if you know you always want to do, like, if you know the majority of the time, like you want to go from color on your color wheel, you want to scroll through all the colors, or you want to see those cool all the gobos scroll through, like Matt was talking about earlier, you can actually go and change your default path already automatically, so that it possibly could save you some time there. It just depends on what you necessarily want as well. And no, I don't remember if you talked about it though, but you can also, when you're typing in your timing, and this is something I just wanted to mention because we kind of try to hit syntax a bit. When you're typing in your timing and you're trying to mess with your timing like the programmer, you can also just say color time or color time and just adjust directly your color values. So rather than adjusting the whole cue or like all the values inside that cue. So like if you wanted Q3's intent, or if you just wanted an intensity to change, you could say Q1 intensity time 5 enter, and that would just change Q1's intensity time. It won't touch the rest of your cues timing.
Yep.
And that's just following the source mask type situation there, where your source is Q1, your mask is the time. Then you do your data that you want to change it to, and then enter to actually change it.
All right, let's talk about how to make a chase. So what I just did is I'm in my programmer right now, and I selected the psych fixtures again, with them going from left to right, selected in that order, had them go red, and then had them go to full intensity. And then I went through in my delay time, and I just typed in time 0 through 5, enter? Yeah, through 5. So whenever I play back this cue, and actually I can test it by pressing blind and then turning on what's called fade changes in the programmer. And I should be able to see that my cue will look something kind of like that. So let's talk about how to basically make a chase. So you might be given an example from the director where they're like, I want my cyc to go from red to purple to blue to orange back to red, right? So that can be done relatively easily. So I've currently got the first cue recorded, which is just red. And then we'll go ahead and change, what was the next one I said, purple?
Red to purple to blue to orange and back to red.
So here we are, purple. What's nice is that the fade and delay times that I have my programmer are actually still being tracked through my cues. So what did I say? It's a blue.
And then to orange.
I'll do a little cyan blue. There we go. Record here and then back to that orange color. Forward that onto here. So now we should have 4 cyc cues here. Just go ahead and play them, make sure they function correctly. And so here's the first cue. Next cue, we're going from left to right. And the next cue will go from left to right. I think I'm going to change the fade time to be closer to 5 seconds. So it'll be a little bit of a larger transition. There you go. That looks a little better. So what if you wanted all these cues to run in a loop? So what you could do is you could trigger the wait column here, and you could say, hey, all these cues follow each other. So we'll go ahead and enable that for now. So basically, as soon as the previous cue is complete, the next cue will go ahead and trigger through. So you'll just see a constant change going on at the site. You can also turn it into what's called a chase. So I'm going to backspace and remove all the wait and follow times here. And go into the cue list options, and we're going to say, this is a chase. Oh, I should figure the button. Here it is. So we're going to say, this is a chase. And now, if I press play, it's going to actually run really, really fast. That's just because the default chase is 120 BPM. But basically, it's just going to be running up and down the cue list, or sorry, just going down the cue list from one cue to another. So it is going really quickly. Let's go ahead and just change that. So if I were to go into into the playback options window again, currently it's set to playback rate at 120 beats per minute. I'm going to cut that down by like 25%, so we're going to say 30 beats per minute. So that should slow it down pretty heavily, and you should see the chase happening on stage. Let's change my fade time to 0. Set it back to, there you go. It's always a game to kind of figure out the best sort of crossfade times and getting your timing right. But there you go. There's a nice sort of loop of colors going across the stage right now.
Have you guys talked about the tap tempo thing with the BPM?
Not yet.
I can certainly talk about it.
Ooh, well, just because you were talking about BPM, I was like, we can do this too.
Yeah. We should talk about all the ways to change your chase rate.
Yes.
You can totally do that. So this is not docked. So there is a thing called playback bar docking. So I have a hoglet here, but I don't have the faders assigned virtually. So I'm going to really quickly dock them. So now my faders are sort of controlling the functions of the console. This is on like 5. So there's a few ways that you can control the playback rate. So like what Matt was talking about is you can do what's called a BPM. So with that, if you hold down the choose key on that master and then you press the play key right underneath it, so not the main play key, but the key underneath it, you can create a BPM master. So I'm pressing this really quickly, I get a really fast chase, and I can go really slow. And I've slowed down the chase. My voice also slowed down for some reason. For empathet. For emphasis. So you can do, depending on how fast you want it to run, you can kind of hold choose and press that play button to get the speed to your liking, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
You can also control it on the fader. So I'm going to go ahead and let's set this back to 120 beats per minute. So that's the default BPM here going across. But there's this wonderful thing called control sets now. So I gotta switch your view so you can actually see the left-hand screen because this is a virtual window. So if I were to hold down choose on this master, there you go, you'll see that a little window comes up that gives you a couple of different, these are called control sets. So one of them is playback rate. And what that essentially does is switches your fader, instead of being intensity, to be a playback rate fader. And you can actually see what they do by going into the options and going to the playback rate tab, and you can actually see what these options do now. So the fader is essentially a playback rate scaler where the upper bound is 16 times and the lower bound is 0 times. So if I rack my fader down to 0, or pretty close to low 0, you'll see that it's moving, but it's going very, very slowly. If I start pushing it up, it'll go significantly faster, almost so fast that it can't keep up. So you can do a 16 times. I almost never do. I usually either do a 4 times or 8 times. So we'll do 4 times as my max.
16 is kind of insane.
Yeah. It is. But I mean, if you have like an intensity chase or something like that, I can see some reasoning behind it.
If you're doing like blown light bulbs or like a power surge, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And then I personally like to always have the lower bound of 0, so that if I pull it down, I can always stop it.
Yep.
Wherever I am in that cue list. But some people prefer it to be any of the other different options. You can also set the key itself to be a set function. So if I can want to just temporarily flash that key, I'm flashing my playback essentially. And that's a flash at 16 times, but you could also do, say, a flash at 1. So push my fader up, running really fast, hold down the flash key, we're slowing back down, going really fast. So there's a lot that you can do with your playback rate scaler. You can also make it a temporary pause by holding 0. Just hold it and it's paused. And then you let it go and it runs again.
By pressing what? I'm sorry, I've never actually done that before. I'm learning something new.
So scale playback rate. So
Yeah.
You can temporarily set it, which is what I prefer. Yeah. You set it, either set or you can multiply, and then a value of, say, 0.
Yeah. Okay. Value of 0. Got it.
Basically just pause it. Yeah. So
sorry, I thought I just heard for a second you just hit 0, and I was like, oh, you hit 0 on the keypad? That's amazing.
Yeah, that would be kind of cool.
It's all good.
So another thing with that's really kind of handy about chases is that you can add a cue in relatively easy. So I'm going to pause it. So I'm going to let it just kind of, actually going to skip to this cue here. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to essentially suck in the fade and delay times. Because if I were to go in and add a new cue, the times would be the default times because I would have my programmers clear. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my select across group and I'm going to press suck, and that should suck all the values into the programmer, including it didn't suck in the fade and delay times, just kidding. It should. Let's do this. Let's do Q2 copy enter. For some reason it didn't get my fade and delays. Oh, there we go. It did this time. So another way that you can sort of suck values into the programmer is you could say copy to enter, and it just takes your cue, your source, which is Q2, and sucks it into your programmer. And so now we can change and we can add a new color. So if I were to say pick a new color of, say, white, I can add that into this cue stacks. If I say hit record and I hit list 6 here on master 5 and I press clear, if I replay this, there will now be essentially a white cue added into the mix, which is kind of handy that if you just need to add an extra color or take out a color or anything like that, it's really easy to do. Another function that I really enjoy is that you can also control the direction. So the default direction is up, where it's just going across the cue list, but you can also say down, where essentially it'll run backwards through the cue list. You could also say random, which is kind of neat because it just picks a completely different cue every time. And that's really handy when you've got like 20,000 different cues and you just, you don't want the same sort of effect to be running back and forth, because, this is really quite interesting. However, it's repetitive. So I've used bounce a lot, especially when I'm doing like pixel bars at like nightclubs and things like that. Just kind of a different arrangement every time, but you kind of have the theme of colors. And then you could also do bounce, which basically goes up the cue list, down the cue list, up the cue list, down the cue list.
Yeah. I've used this on when I had to create an Aurora Borealis effect for a show called Almost Maine. And I was
Almost Maine.
Yeah, it's a great show. Sorry, no, you're fine. It's Noah was talking about clubs. I was like, we're in theater. We're talking about theater, no clubs.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I just did a bar thing this weekend, and I just basically did that exact example. So that's why it's on my mind.
It's all good.
I like it for like to do like twinkly stars. So like if we want to do twinkly stars across like all these, I don't even know what's back there, but across those dots in the back, like you could very easily just like start. Record it full, get them all in there, and then do a random chase across everything.
And then select them randomly by your random selection.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I also did it for like camera flat when I did hairspray. We did, but we needed to do a bunch of random camera flashes. That's how I did it. I just did it on a list.
So here we are. There's all 723.8 fixtures. Really cool tool is that, like you were just talking about, random is select and random. We'll just pick a random fixture just out of the blue, and we'll go ahead and record onto, let's put that on 4, and then you can do the same thing again. Select random, record, enter. Oops. Select random.
You're hitting it full right before you hit record.
Oh yeah, you're right. At full, record, enter. Thank you.
Remember that highlight thing we talked about? How highlight could bite us in the butt?
Yep, there it is.
Random.
But then what you're discovering is it so you have to record it cue only though. Because now
you do. I'm getting there.
We're getting there.
Okay, all right. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You weren't in on that planning. You're good.
Okay, my bad. I'm gonna STF.
Select random. I'm just gonna do this like maybe 10 times.
Yeah, we're not gonna do it all 700 times.
That would be kind of fun.
Or you could just pixel map it and run low res content through it.
Right. That's another thing. I probably, if I wanted to do this over and over and over again, this would be a case that I would actually write a keystroke macro inside for Hog, is to just hit select and then random at full, record, enter, and run that. And then every time I wanted to run it, I could just tap that keystroke macro. So for a repetitive task like that, that's mainly the reason why I'd write keystroke macros inside my theater shows, is so that if I have 700 something lights like this, I can actually run it over and over and over again.
So you're actually just tapping the screen 738 times as opposed to...
Yeah, or I could then have, it just depends how much time I want to do it into it. I could then have it go into a list and just do like a link 700 and something times.
Yeah.
And it just depends how much time, which that is still probably less time than recording 700 individually times.
Yes.
So Matt, you brought this up. You're like, oh no, but it's going to track, right? Just like our last video. So this is when you go in, you disable tracking. So if you look at this cue list as I'm punching down, the lights are tracking through from previous cues. So if I were to go into options and say cue only, and then close this window, now if I press play, you'll only see the contents of that one cue, and the values are not going to be tracking through.
Can you make the fade time actually 0 on that just for the people watching on the video?
Yeah, yeah. So it's at 0 now. So now if you go in and I basically set it as a chase. Now if you press play, you've got essentially your really rough twinkle effect. You would probably want to do like a fade and delay time there.
So really, this is a really crappy twinkle effect.
You could dim down the fader a little bit.
Yeah.
Every now and then.
Yeah, we need a little bit of refinement, but this is also a perfect example of, hey, random. And now you know for a fact it will always be sort of that random effect.
Yeah, this would probably be like, I'm going to change because you can also change the up and down time for the fade. So it would probably be like, let's change the up and down time on the fade and make it. I mean, of course, there's a lot more refinement that's needed. It's just like, here are the possibilities.
You guys have talked about split times, right?
I don't know if we did it in this one, but I know we have before.
Okay.
Because it always gets asked. But if you want to talk about it real quick, you can.
Oh, no, it's just what we were talking about is split up and down fade times. Just in your time that Noah is doing in there, if you want an uptime of 1 and a downtime of 2, it's just 1/2 enter. Mm-hmm. And that's global for the cue.
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
Looks way better, Noah. Looks closer to what I'm going for here. Good work.
No, I mean, like you can throw something together and here you go. So one kind of nice thing about Chase is now we kind of created this look, and maybe you might like need to recycle it a couple of times. You probably in your sort of main cue list for your show, you probably don't want to have, either link cues, or you could do it that way, but you probably don't want to be programming this into each of the cues that you're going to be running. It can get really convoluted. So what you can do is you can use what's called a comment macro to essentially trigger and disable this cue list. So this cue list is list 7. So we're going to keep that number in mind. And let's go ahead and go back to this other cue list that we created the other day. So this is just a really simple cue list. Nothing really dramatic going on, but there's some cues already put in. So let's just say that in Q2, this cue here, you also wanted to sort of trigger that cue list from that we created earlier, the sort of twinkle cue list. So that's what this column right here is for, the macro column. And so if I were to go into here, and it's going to bring up a sub window, so let me switch over here. It brings up a little window where you can essentially specify what you want to happen. So if you were to say, where'd you go? You're usually at the top. Go cue list, and then the magic number of 7, enter. What essentially that means is that when I trigger this cue, so we'll go ahead and switch it back. Not only did that second cue trigger, but our chase also triggered as well. And then you can go into that cue list and say, hey, in Q4, I want that to stop. You can go in and say, hey, I want to release cue list 7, which I will find here. Search release cue list 7, RL7. So now if I were to press play, because of tracking, the chase is still running on. I press play onto Q4, and now we've released that cue list. So that's really handy for theater applications when you've got that twinkle effect, or you've got the Northern Lights effect. I use this for like a fire effect. I did a show where there's like a bunch of hobos chill on a oil drum, and basically there's Christmas lights inside, and I basically just had a fire chase that would just run on sort of a random loop essentially, and I used that throughout the show, and I didn't have to record that into every single cue, that chase. I didn't have to create it in the effect engine. I got to do it as a chase. And what's nice about this as well is it's basically referenced. So if you were to go in and add a cue to your chase, you don't have to add it in several locations in your cue list. It's already sort of referenced in a separate cue list. So really just handy tool for creating different effects within your show.
The other thing that's really cool about it is you can actually assign fade times to override your normal time. So, and you could also set fader levels. So say that effect is assigned to a fader instead of like go list, you can type go fader, whatever it is for, and then a / and the percentage that you want it to fade up to. And if you have automated faders on your console, your faders will actually ride up. So you could say, go master 4 / 50 lowercase t5, which that syntax would basically be fader 4 will fade up in to 50% in 5 seconds. So it's another cool thing to do for triggering those type of things. The thing that's great about the list is you don't have to have that list assigned to a fader. It would just fire the list out of the queue list directory.
Yeah, and that's really handy as well, because if you're doing a theater show and you've got like either a volunteer or a dad, or you're doing something where you're not the board operator, you can automate a lot of functions on the console, like moving that fader up or moving the grandmaster up. So I always make it where the very first cue sets the grandmaster to full.
Grandmaster
also sets that cue list to full. So that's really basically go in and fade grandmaster 100 enter, and so now I'm gonna move my grandmaster down.
That's actually a really good tip. I haven't thought about doing.
The other thing is I do this on like when I do cruise ship projects, and everything needs to be automated because these things are going to run for like 10 years.
Right.
I basically do comment macros for everything to make sure that faders are up to because you never know. Somebody could go in, accidentally hit a fader down, and then the effect is gone.
Right.
Ultimate save your butt.
Mm-hmm.
So to showcase what you were talking about, so you can do a time function on that fade master or that fade grandmaster. So if you look in that queue list window there for Q2, it says GL7, so that basically means go list 7, and then fade master FM4, and then /100 T2. So that means that you're going to fade master 4 to a value of 100, so full intensity, but with a time of 2 seconds. So it's kind of cool is if you look on the front panel of the console there on the bottom part of the screen, and I press play, it'll actually cross fade up. And then I did the same thing for Q4, where now it goes down. So if I trigger Q3, nothing really happens on that master, but if I trigger Q4, now over 5 seconds, it is cross fading out.
Yeah.
So really handy tool.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Noah. The other thing that's really cool about that is you can actually fade your master out and then have a secondary macro in that same command line to release it. So if for some reason you don't want to change your release times or the release time is different, you can actually just fade your master out. And then once it's complete, you can do a release of that list. All about automation. So
yeah,
definitely.
I mean, I don't think we'll need to go into all the different functions.
Yeah, no. It's actually, but if you guys get a chance, go into those macros, you can see a lot of you have like enable time code, disable time code. So if there were moments where, if you're doing a partially queue list driven show and then it needs to go into a manual sequence, you can just do automate it all through there in the macro. So.
You could do one of my favorites is also release others. So it basically says release everything else except for me. So release all, which would actually release the queue list you're in, but also release others, and also go macro. So if you have a keystroke macro that you want to trigger, that's done through here, as well as if you have MIDI notes. There's not actually any MIDI notes in the show file, but if there were, you could send a MIDI note out of the desk from your queue list. So there's a ton of options. If you guys are not familiar with these comment macros, and they're probably one of the grandest and fastest tools in the console. So if you're not familiar with it, please check it out. It's in our user manual. We don't really have time to talk about all of them.
Yeah.
But they are wonderful functions. You can change pages, recall views,
everything, pretty much everything.
Dock playback bars.
And they also apply to scenes as well. Just putting that out there. So
Yes.
if you are using scenes in your show file, you can recall them from scenes, and then you can also, and I just wanted to reiterate, when Matt said, like, if you have consoles with moving faders, those also work for consoles without moving faders.
Yeah.
I get that call a lot. I just wanted to put it out there. Like, it does
Sure.
work. Like, if you don't have them moving, obviously the faders aren't going to move. But you can actually see on the screen here how there's that blue bar in the playback bar, like on fader 10. You can see where that physical red dot is. That's showing where the physical fader is, and then the blue is the level of the virtual fader. So like you would just have to go and catch it with the fader, and then you can move the fader however you want.
I mean, if it was fully, sorry, I didn't mean to generate any confusion.
No, I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page.
Very much so.
Yeah.
So Megan, since you did bring it up, the way that you do a comment macro in a scene is a little different than the queue list window. So a scene is a single queue list. So just for those of you guys that don't know how to do it, you'll actually have to go into the list view of the scene, and then that's when you can run the macros in that for that scene specifically. Another thing is you don't actually have to have data in your scene or your queue to trigger a comment macro. So that's kind of handy because if you just want to have a button in your scene directory that changes your page or calls a view, but you don't want to trigger any lights, you can essentially create that and then throw it into wherever you want in your scene directory, queue list directory, whatever, and you did your function for you automatically.
I do that for timing. I believe I do it for timing. So if I want to do global changes to my timings of my scenes, I do it through there. And I just have a button in my scenes that I can press that will just be like, instead of typing scene 1 through 100 times 0, enter, like I just have a button I can push.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But that's rock and roll. I use that for rock and roll.
Yeah.
Try to keep it to theater here.
If I'm I do tests in there, or like if I'm especially during tech, like I'll have an enable, and if I'm doing something with timecode, which is popular more in dance than theater, but then I'll have an enable and disable timecode buttons just right there, so I don't have to open each and every single queue list to figure out which one I'm timecoding. I can just very quickly just say at this point, disable timecode on all of my lists at the same time, or disable all timecode, or enable all timecode. I usually don't, but enable it all. But it would be a disable all timecode button just right there with that comment macro if needed. Yeah.
I mean, of course, these are all things you could do it. Yeah, I mean, and you could obviously do this in having the keystroke macro window open too. It's just another way of doing it.
Yeah. Or you could use a comment macro to fire a keystroke macro, which is what I was talking about earlier, to loop 700 times. Comment macros, they're great. Look into them. See what you can do. If you have a question on whether it's possible to do with a comment macro, email support@highend.com and we will help you out there.
I like that plug. Good plug.
I try.
So something that was also kind of on our list, so I'm going to kind of move on a little bit here, is some differences for getting intensities on stage. So what I did just now is I essentially created a new page. So just kind of wiped my playback bar so there's no extra junk on there for this example. But something that comes up a lot of times in, especially in the theater world for our classes, is how do I control intensity on a fader, right? So everything that's on a fader is a playback function, which what that means is that the programmer always has higher priority than playback. So it's kind of a thing to keep in mind. Anything you do in the programmer has higher priority than a playback. There's a few ways that you can sort of just put intensity on a fader. So the first one is called use HTP. So what I'm going to do here is if you hold down choose on that master, I hit this little shortcut here for use HTP. What that essentially means now is that my fader is an intensity fader for the lights in that queue. And there's some pros and cons to that. So the pro to using HTTP is it's going to basically stay on unless you override it with the programmer. So if you had another queue list, so if I were to go to the next page here and start playing other things with those lights, oops, actually that won't work because of a preference that I have on. Let's do this. We'll talk about this maybe later.
That's a lovely little queue there you got going on.
Oh my gosh, that's that is a lot of fun, isn't it?
We said we were programmers, Matt, not designers.
It's for an example. So
Call
with
me.
an HTTP fader up, the light's intensity will always basically be on. And that means that if you have another cube where you tell those lights to go to 0, which I don't think I have for these functions, they will not be overridden. Okay, so it's kind of nice about HTTP faders is if you push them up, they're going to stay up. But it can be kind of annoying because if you say release all, so if I hit pig release, you'll note that the lights are still on stage. So that's something to kind of keep in mind is that HTTP faders do not get released. So it's depends on how your workflow is. It depends on your preference. I generally only do HTTP faders for things like work light or house light or things that don't normally follow in with the normal show function. But that's just a personal preference of mine. Another way that you can basically put on intensity on a fader is by going into your options and going to the standard tab and essentially saying go off 0 and release at 0 on the fader. So what essentially that means is that if you're coming off of the 0 value from the bottom part of your fader and it basically goes that cue list, and then if you bring it all the way down to 0, it also releases that cue list. So I basically did this on the second cue list here, list number 9, where if I push my fader up, it is gone the cue list. So I'll kind of preview the fader here. So now I'm at 0, push my fader up, it's going to go. Take my HTTP fader down. Hey, look, it did exactly what I said it was going to do. So now I can crossfade my cue list in, bring it all the way down, and it releases. So what's kind of handy about that is that if I trigger this, and then I have something else that I want to take control of those lights, it will do that, right? So if I have, let's do this, let's do live enter. I'm just going to grab all my fixtures, and I'm just going to do a circle effect, and let's do a step wave. I'm going to just create a really quick effect, guys. So there we go, got a little effect going. When I hit record, put that onto cue list 8, press clear. So what this essentially means is that if I were to trigger this other cue list, right, it doesn't, it actually allows the values of intensity to go down. Whereas if I had used the intensity of the HTTP fader, and I push my HTTP fader up, see how that effect is not really running. The position is, but the intensity part is not. So it's kind of an advantage or disadvantage depending on how your brain works, your workflow works. You might want to use one function or the other. There is also another function called persist on override. And so this kind of falls back into using multiple cue lists for your show. If you see here, if I were to press play on this effect list, and then I were to release this effect list, hit release here, the lights actually should, oh, oops, actually fader up. Normally they'll fade out to 0. So let me see if I can do that again. So I press list, press play on the effect list, and then I release that list. Oh, it's actually staying active. Well, that's awkward.
This is where we're going to go back and post and edit this out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
But we probably won't because it's good troubleshooting. I always get
Yeah,
questions. I get like what in the surveys sometimes I was like they were like, can you post your troubleshooting video, like how you troubleshoot when this happens? And I'm like, I'll just tell the video team to not edit my issues, and then you can see me actual troubleshoot.
We don't have persist on override enabled. I was going to do this as a persist on override example, and I don't know why.
Turn off HTTP on your other fader. Just turn off. I stay away from HTTP unless they're house, except for work lights. But
Yeah, I really HTTP ends up boning you.
also most of my theater shows I'll now have turned into like high school and middle school shows, so I'm programming them for, you know, kids to be the board ops. So it is it is just literally pretty much almost as much automation as Matt puts in. I usually don't touch HTTP at all.
Oh,
for
I think
those
I know.
shows, and everything just gets triggered from a single queue list.
I know what it was.
Um,
I didn't have intensity in the of this third queue list.
well, that would also play a factor.
There you go. There you go. So now I can use the example correctly. So we're gonna have to edit that, but no big deal. So essentially, with the function of the console, if I were to press play on list 10 here, this effect is essentially running. It should be an intensity effect. Darn, what did we do? Oh, I got rid of the.
Do you have an off table?
Yeah. Man, look at this example. Let's do this. Set, step wave, offset, 0 through 180 through 0. That's my inside out. The size and rate will do set 60 to 50. There we go. So now we got this wild effect. And let's go ahead and release everything. So there you go. Under normal circumstances, here we've got this fader that's being pushed up. And if I press play on the other cue list, under normal circumstances, if you were to press release, you'll actually go straight to black. So there's this little function that I know we've talked about in other videos called persist on override, where what essentially that means is that if a cue list is overridden by another function, it will fall back to that cue list. So if I hold down choose on this master and I say persist on override, this little button here at the bottom, soft key, what that now means, if I press play on this list and I press play on the other cue list, and then you release, release that other cue list, it's going to fall back to the cue list on number 9. So why do we bring all this up? The reason why we brought it up is that if you're going to be using multiple cue lists and merging them in with other cue lists, you probably want your main cue list to have what's called persist on override enabled. So that way, if another cue list overrides those fixtures, the other cue list the values will fall back on it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's kind of like an assert kind of thing, like a self-assert.
Yep. I call it my get out of jail free card, because it'll save me from going completely dark if I don't need to. But yeah. Like I said, I utilize multiple cue list shows all the time, cue lists, because like I said, I run off a single cue list most of the time, so that other cue lists on the faders don't confuse the poor high schooler that's trying to make sense of what I'm doing behind the console. And what that generally ends up meaning is everything is dumped and everything's triggered via comment macros.
What's crazy to me is you saying that you do this for high schoolers or middle schoolers, and I do the same thing for massive, large cruise ships. It's really, I don't know. Is it just, what does that say about the cruise ships, or what does that say about the high schoolers? I do not know.
Everybody
These are the more affluent high schools in the area.
Oh, okay. So you're saying cruise ships are the equivalent of high schools?
No, cruise ships are the equivalent of 3 of the high schools here in this area.
Yeah, so Matt, I'm going to let you in on some information, and for anyone else that's watching this video, Texas, which is where me and Megan are based, passed a law in 2010 where the amount of budget that you put towards athletics has to be matched to the arts. And if you know anything about Texas, we love our football, right?
Love your
and
football.
So what that means is that almost all the schools in Texas have like these state-of-the-art, either, now it doesn't specify whether, the money has to go towards choir or band or theater or art or whatever. It just says that the amount of money that you put towards athletics has to be matched to the arts, which is awesome because it means a lot of the schools here in Texas, like even my husband's high school, has a huge rig compared to, anything else you'll find around, and at that high school even. So it's actually really quite awesome because it gets students engaged into the sort of technical arts. But yeah, no, we've seen rigs of like Soliframe 750s and Soliframe 1000s in high schools, and it's like, this is really nice for a high school.
Apparently, when I retire from touring, I'm moving to Texas and teaching high schoolers because it'll be a better rig than than some stuff that I've worked on.
It's pretty cool.
One of the high schools I go to frequently, they have, well, I guess let's finish this and then we can talk about what the other high school has. Because, or are we? I don't want. Are we good on? Is there
We
anything else?
are
about
literally
this
making
video?
everyone jealous right now, by the way. Damn you.
We'll cover plots and pixel mapping next week and
Yeah.
some other functions in the console that we kind of left off for this series, and we'll cover all that next week. And yeah, so we'll move into sort of an informal Q&A. So if anyone else that's watching, they have a random question about what we talked about today, or any hog question in general that you want to ask for me, Megan, or Matt, you're more than welcome to ask that in the Q&A.
And this is where crickets happen.
I guess I'll mention it now, and then if not, we don't get any questions, we'll just tell video to cut it. The high school, it's Lake Travis High School. I mean, we all know I'm in Austin, so I'll just say what high school it is. It's Lake Travis High School. They have, 12 Solo Spot 2000s, I think, of whatever the Verilight 4000s. Those match. So whatever they have in the overhead, they have that. They have 4 quads. And I think they have some frame 1500s. They have a Hog 418, a Road Hog 4, a Geo at 5. They just switched 2 years ago. No, yeah, two August ago. They just redid their LED panels in their pack to have to be some kind of Barco LED panels in the end there.
Matt's just blown away by this.
And they also
Literally,
their fly system also goes. I think they have an electronic fly system as well.
Iris in the chat is like, that's more than the community college I work with has. My mind's blown. I'm going to Texas. Forget this New York. Texas, here I come.
Well, I mean, Matt, you know my husband, so he went to Booker T. Washington, which is like the performing arts magnet high school in Dallas, downtown Dallas. And last time I was there, they had 50 movers, and they have like a 25 batten automated system.
Oh,
It's funny because he came, yeah, in high school, yeah, and so he came from a really nice automated system, and like the first day we met in college, he had to learn how to throw bricks on a counterweight system, the most janky counterweight system, and he was like, "What is this?"
yeah. No. When I went to Boston University, like we had a Altman and a mixed inventory Altman and like Source 4, and we had a counterweight system. It was the Huntington Theater Company, and then my sophomore year, we got this grant. And it was like the Light Palette 90 was the lighting console. Like it was just like, what? And then we got a grant and we got Obsession 2, Hog 500, all ETC, like dimmer doubling, the big moving lights at the time. We got studio spots, studio colors, cyber lights, CXI. That's what I mean.
Like
showing your age, Matt.
UT being in Austin, don't have any new stuff.
I graduated in 2003. Okay, you were probably a baby.
I was
in the third grade. Yeah, me and Megan were the same age.
Well, whatever. My birthday is coming up in like a week, and it's my last day of my 30s, or my last year of my 30s. So this is going to be really interesting.
Right on.
What a way to celebrate.
I know, right? With you guys.
Yeah.
You guys are kind of quiet in the Q&A, so I think we'll go ahead and stop this here. If you guys do have any further questions, support@highend.com. You can also email me or Megan directly if you want, but support@highend.com is usually the best way to get to our team. Matt, it's always good to see you. We'll
good to see you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. And then we will see you the week after, too, for Hog Factor, I believe, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You guys...
We haven't announced that yet?
It's been announced.
It has been that we're doing something on October 8th? Okay.
Has it?
We're doing a super cool thing October 8th for those of y'all that are still...
It has now.
They'll just cut it out if they'll just fix it in post.
Yeah. Great. So much stuff can be fixed in post.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.